Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 37. My guest in this episode is Andrés Gómez Emilsson. Andrés is president and director of research of the Qualia Research Institute. And background on Andrés is he has a master's degree in psychology with an emphasis on computational models from Stanford, and has a professional background in graph theory, statistics, and affective science. And Andrés and I have a really kind of awesome conversation that goes around what they're doing at the Qualia Research Institute. And we start with the philosophy of the program and what they're doing. And then he explains a little bit of the science behind what they're doing. So I very much enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully Andrés enjoyed the conversation, but I know, speaking for myself, it was a pleasure speaking with him, and it was very informative as well, and I hope that's a takeaway for you. So sit back and enjoy this conversation. And I put on a special background music just for Andrés in this conversation, because it's a pretty wild and out there conversation, and I thought it deserved a little something other than my little guitars if you're a regular viewer of my interviews. And for the record, this is a piece that I generated myself on one of my synthesizers, and if you're for any reason curious and you like drone, I will put a link to the channel where I feature these pieces that I generate. So you're welcome to check that out. I make no revenue from that, just like this show, so I'm not shilling for revenue or Patreon or anything like that. So enjoy the conversation with Andrés, and thank you for tuning in. Andrés, welcome to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm really happy to have you here today, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation with you.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to it.
Yeah. And you and I had some conversation back and forth, and you had TEDx talk set up, and you were able to come to Miami, which I think is awesome. How was your experience in Miami? Did you enjoy the vibe? Did you enjoy the people there and your time there? Because you're on the West Coast, right? You're in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So
No, Miami was
good. It was
Miami
good.
was like amazing. So there's definitely like a couple of things I can mention about it. I mean, first of all, I think like the weather, but also probably the kind of people who live there. I mean, I guess I was more in the touristy areas in general. I guess like what is like South downtown Miami and Miami Beach. So but you can definitely notice like an average higher hedonic tone in people. Like people seem like generally pretty happy on the streets, and like pretty. Like also you can tell from the music. So like something that I do for fun, like whenever I travel, and whenever there's like a song that I don't know that is like playing in the background, whether it's in a restaurant or an Uber or like a friend is playing it, I just like ask my my Android like, what song is this, and then just kind of like make a playlist of it, so I can then like play those songs and then remember what the trip was like. And definitely all the Miami songs were like very, very upbeat relative to many other places that I went to. But then definitely there was kind of like two phases to the experience. Was like first the TEDx like component, and I was like really focused. I mean, like I really thought of my TED talk as kind of a man on a mission. It's kind of like, okay, this has to be done. It's very important stuff. I better do it right. And like, so I took it very seriously, and like I arrived like 5 days before for it, and just like practiced pretty much every day before the TED talk. Didn't go out to party or anything for those days. I think I met one person, but that was about it. But then at the event itself, I think it went great. Got like a lot of positive feedback. I really look forward to when it's posted on YouTube, hopefully soon. TED actually doesn't let you know when or if they're going to post it, so it's actually kind of really up in the air. But I suspect they will post it, and not too far in the future. Like I was kind of like looking for like, okay, what kind of like community could I meet in Miami? Like I had put in Twitter like, hey, I'll be in Miami, like contact me. And a few people contacted me, but the way in which I actually found kind of like a fun like community with a lot of people, like-minded individuals, was finding the Astral Codex 10, / like Slavestar Codex Miami meetup, and then they also have a Discord server. So I went there, and I actually mentioned to them like, hey, I'm gonna do a TED talk, and I have like several free tickets, and like they actually got filled up pretty quickly
Good.
that
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and apologies, you didn't get the free ticket. The free ticket, yeah.
No, no. A good backstory on that. So it worked out perfectly. It worked out fine. So yeah, no worries at all. Whoever got the tickets were meant to have them, and that's perfect. Yeah. So I
So yeah.
well, I was just gonna say I'm not like supernatural superstition, but I believe in serendipity. If it happens, it happens, so it works out great. And just okay, since I'm on that tangent, I went a week later to Miami because I live for the audience, I live 2 hours north of Miami, hour and a half when the traffic's not bad. And I went the following week and so botany and horticulture is my first love, and then philosophy and other things. And I met a botanist at the University of Miami, Gifford Arboretum rather. And it wouldn't have happened if I had gone the week before. And I made connections through him to do some things that I want to do. And because I have this kind of plant altruism that I'm doing. And so anyway, it worked out perfectly. I wouldn't have met that guy had I not been there a week later. So it worked out great. So
fantastic.
So you got some people to go from that community to check out the talk. Yeah, that's cool.
And I think actually like 5 people went because of the free tickets. And then 5 people actually bought a ticket from that community. So
nice.
It was really fun, like during the presentation, and then right after in the after party, like there was like 10 cool people to hang out with right away, and
awesome.
And then like the next 4 days, I just like spent from one event to another of that crowd, and I don't know, I recommend if you like the sort of thing that I'm gonna be talking about, or I guess like if you're interested in rationality and consciousness and stuff, I do recommend like getting in touch with them if you go to Miami because they're really friendly, very smart. Like,
okay, yeah. Crowd. Yeah, I'll get access through you to them at some point, and I'll check them out because and being a shameless person when it comes to shilling myself for this interview series, I'll look and see if I can find people who are interested in coming on and having interesting conversations. So if there are people there that want to do that, that's great. In fact, when I was researching your TEDx event, there was another speaker there. All the speakers sounded really cool, but there was another gal who does. She's a therapist and she does dance therapy, and she's down in Miami Beach. And so I'm going to interview her. She's out of the country right now, but when she gets back, I'm going to speak with her. So I got another lead through that as well. So that'll be fun.
Fantastic.
So the talk was good. There was a good after party. So overall, and I agree, Miami is it's pretty. Hedonistic is good, but in a good way. I say that in a positive way because the zest for life is there. It's such like I grew up in Washington D.C. and it was a very international community, but it's also the vibe there is. I mean, this is going back 35 years, but the vibe is serious. But it's also just so dynamic because there's so many people there. But Miami is, I consider it an extension of the Caribbean. I don't really think it much as the contiguous United States, and I say that I was raised by a parent who grew up in Venezuela. So, I mean, I have a little bit of that vibe going just culturally, from having been exposed to that. So I love Miami in that sense. So you got people from Dominica and Cuba and Puerto Rico and all these beautiful confluence of cultures and Haiti and just all these beautiful cultures coming together. So Miami is an experience. In fact, when we were there a week after your TED Talk, I went into a little El Rinconcito in what they call Flagami, it's just south of downtown, and they didn't speak any English in the breakfast cafe called El Rinconcito, and I had to pull out my old Spanish, and it was terrible, but I did my best, and the lady was, we worked together. I have the capacity of about a 2-year-old with Spanish, but I got the nouns out, I told her, but it was cute. So anyway, that's the other thing I love about Miami is I get to break out my little bit of Spanish occasionally. So anyway, you had a good time, and that's awesome.
One also kind of observation here is that I mean, I talk a lot about kind of like what would it be like to recalibrate the hedonic set point. I mean, essentially like, okay, the baseline of hedonic tone that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And people are very skeptical. It's like, well, that seems like unalterable or like, would it even be good, right? But actually, talking to some of the people in the Astral Codex then meetup, they were pointing out like, well, actually, an intuition pump for that might actually be like how people clearly have kind of like different emotional palettes depending on where they live. And yeah, like as you settle in Miami, it's like, okay, yeah, people are here kind of like, maybe like zero point 0.5 standard deviations happier than people elsewhere in the US.
Yeah.
Or I don't know, you go to some other region. It's like, okay, people here are like a little bit sadder than everywhere else. And yeah, kind of like the possibility of actually, ratcheting up the hedonic set point of humanity a little bit, it doesn't seem that far-fetched once you consider there is variance between cities already.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not to overemphasize the Latinx nature of Miami, having a large Cuban community. And I've been to Cuba a few years ago, and I've seen Cuba, and I've seen Cuban Americans for 30 something years living in Florida. And again, having a parent that came from Venezuela, the Latin culture has its priorities, and you work when it's time to work, you study when it's time to study, but you also know that there's a work-life balance or a work joy balance. There's a balance in getting out and doing something with the community, and so that's unique, I think, to that area. And it probably in the Southwest too, you'll see that as well, with just Latinx culture. And again, I'm sorry if I'm stereotyping or speaking out of bounds, but it's the impression that I get is that part of South Florida is just switched on.
Yeah.
They know how to work and they know how to be serious, and they take certain things very serious culturally, but they also know when it's time to have a little fun and not take life too seriously. So, and again, that's generalizing, but take that with all the necessary caveats of relativity and spectral appreciation of just not thinking in strict binary terms and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, well, let me switch gears a little bit here, and we'll start digging into the meat of what I want to talk to you about. Qualia Research Institute. Oh, you know what? Let me just be Captain ADD here for a second. I want to say to the audience that there was an excellent interview or a dialogue, I should say, that Andres had done with a person named Tashin Fogelman. I'm going to have the link down below. I think it's like just an hour and 52 minutes. And if you're like me, you can put it on 1.5 speed, watch it in an hour and 28 minutes or something like that. And still, I'm so ADD that I can watch things on fast speed and still have traction. So if you're not like that, watch it on regular speed. That link will be down below. It is an excellent conversation, and it deals with a lot of Q&A, FAQ kind of things about Qualia Research Institute, about where Andres is coming from, with certain terminology and so forth. So if you want to leave this conversation and come back and then watch that one, I might recommend that. But anyway, having said that, let's open up with just a primer on what QRI is doing, what your manifesto is, and accordingly, I will have links to your website there. I will have links to your YouTube channel and your Twitter social media. But anyway, if you could give us a thumbnail of what QRI is and what your stated goals are, and then we'll ask some nice philosophical questions regarding that.
Absolutely. So there's this concept called a memeplex. I think it was coined by Richard Dawkins. I mean, so memes to begin with are cultural units that self-replicate through communication. And then a memeplex is like clusters of memes and ideas and practices that essentially are synergistic with one another. So sometimes you may, get like a couple pieces from a memeplex, and like on their own, they don't necessarily make all that much sense. But once you see the whole picture, it's like, okay, like they all hang together. And oftentimes I think like changes in paradigm in science are sort of like that. It's like until you see the full picture, like you can't like easily kind of like onboard somebody into, I don't know, like electromagnetism without kind of like having a little bit of a concept of what it is all about. And I would say that QRI is a memeplex. And not only is it a memeplex, it's something a little bit more special, which is what we call a full stack memeplex. And by full stack, I mean that it's a memeplex that aims to actually have like answers, maybe even potential solutions to pretty much any question that you may ask. Okay, like that's enormously ambitious, but it ranges from philosophy to science to like technological applications. So in terms of like what we do, there's really kind of like 3 layers. So there is philosophy, that's like a very big component. I mean, actually, writing philosophy papers and like engaging with like philosophy literature, especially philosophy of mind. Then we have another layer, which is neuroscience, analyzing neuroimaging data sets and trying to make sense of them, with a special emphasis on like exotic states of consciousness, like especially like very pleasant states of consciousness. And then finally, we have also like neurotechnology. It's like, okay, like how do you actually intervene with the nervous system in a way that is kind of a subtle but effective, or like gentle, is not gonna, break apart like pre-existing maintenance systems in the nervous system, but will, maybe do something that the nervous system is not very good at, but it's very helpful. So that's what we do. And then the objectives, I would say there is 3 pillars, and we're going to be talking a lot more about these and writing more essays about these. But I gave a presentation called "The Future of Consciousness" about these 3 pillars. It's also going to be the main topic of the next QRI meetup / party, which is on the 24th of June. So in case this gets released before that, if anybody's interested in going to the party, feel free to send me a direct message and I can send you the invite. So essentially the objectives are threefold. So we have, first is eliminate negative extremes. Essentially there are states of consciousness that are essentially unconscionable, the fact that they exist. They're just so bad. That was like what my TED talk was about, essentially presenting like really hopeful, really hopeful breakthrough technologies for like tackling extreme suffering, extreme pain. Second is increasing baseline, recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, as I was explaining a little bit. And then the third one is, we call it like achieving new heights, essentially investigating the furthest reaches of well-being and, really pleasant, pro-social, happy states of consciousness that, nowadays may not necessarily be sustainable in the sense that you can be there all the time. But, investigating, cataloging them, understanding them, may seem important for kind of crafting a actually positive vision of the future, which is, yeah, I mean, that's something maybe to add, which is like, there is so much futurology out there, but like overwhelmingly, they tend to focus on essentially things that matter from our current Darwinian makeup. Like, for example, like pretty environments according to human aesthetics, or even things such as like status competitions. I mean, like if they talk about neurotechnology, oftentimes it's like, oh, you'll be able to read 100 books per second, or, have huge bandwidth with a super intelligence or something. But all of that, like if you look at the emotional drive behind that futurology, comes down to something like signaling your intelligence or something like that. Whereas like, no, we look at like, okay, what is valuable in the universe? What makes life actually worth living? And yeah, I mean, it turns out is things such as love and compassion and happiness and well-being. And that's, what we really care about at TRI. Another maybe like last frame here is this comes from David Pierce, which is that within transhumanism, you can kind of like think of like the objectives of transhumanism as super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. And by and large, most people who are into futurology or transhumanism focus either on super intelligence or super longevity. And we are like one of the very few plays out there that actually, care about well-being. There's a couple more organizations that are also out there, like tiny. I'm happy to talk about them. But yeah, I mean, I would say like as kind of like a serious group that is funded with a mission, yeah, like there's almost nobody else on this track.
Okay. And I think that correlates nicely. As people discover your work, they'll see that you are informed by some of the Buddhist teachings. And so that maps on pretty nicely with some of the concepts or ideas, the teachings of the Buddha. And so I appreciate that. I'm not a practicing Buddhist per se, but I learn, I take from that. It's a heuristic that I can draw from. So I'll mention that because I think there's some good correlation there. So Qualia Research Institute, we're going to talk about Qualia. And so I'll start with the big C in the room, it's just consciousness. And so you have an interesting and novel ambition to see a sort of mathematic rhythm or underpinning of consciousness. So let me, and God knows I'm crude and naive, but so I'm going to say, we have on a spectrum, we have phenomenal consciousness, and then we have access consciousness. And so consciousness as a noun and consciousness perhaps as a verb, and some people would probably throw stuff at their computer when I say that, but that's okay. That's how I'm going to explicate for a second here. And so within this spectrum, I see this kind of potential for oscillation. Like I stay agnostic for the phenomenal end. I mean, the grounding ontological nature of consciousness to me is just, make it X, and, it can be a Bayesian variable that can come in occasionally. But so what I'm trying to get to, I guess, is your guys are more on sort of the access end of the spectrum to derive sort of a mathematic, calculable mapping potential with consciousness, but again, consciousness that we use every day, or consciousness that is experiential and in relation with phenomenology, right? Is that doing it any justice? Or please correct me if I didn't.
No. I mean, all this is a good kind of a framing that there's all of these different kind of like insights or ways of looking at consciousness. And I mean, Curie definitely is pretty opinionated on what consciousness is and how to approach it. So definitely the thing that we are interested in would be phenomenal consciousness. So like,
okay.
We might actually go as far as to say that there's like a lot of states of consciousness and mind designs that may actually have a lot of consciousness that is actually not introspectively accessible, meaning that you can't report on them, even though they're there. They're actually like influencing your experience, but you just can't actually say anything about them. We happen to actually be in a corner of mind design, like humans, where a lot of our experience is accessible for reporting. I think like that there's a spectrum, like some people have like way better introspective skills than others, but I mean, to a large extent, like a lot of our experience is reportable, but that's not a necessary condition. I think that you can have like very, very conscious entities that may lack really key introspective skills. It doesn't make the consciousness any less morally relevant. and yeah, I mean, that's why we're called the Qualia Research Institute. Qualia as the raw, sensate way in which experience presents itself. The blueness of blue. That's what we care about. And in particular, the thing we care the most about, both at the institute, and actually we claim everybody, although they may not be introspectively aware of this, is the valence of experience. How good or bad the experience feels.
Okay.
We do have, I guess, like maybe to address some of the things you mentioned. We think of a consciousness as a thing rather than as a process. And likewise, we also think of consciousness within physicalism, essentially like is going to be found in the domain of physics rather than in domain of computation. And for a lot of people, actually, that is confusing. Like these two things like may seem interchangeable or maybe, two sides of the same coin. But I would claim that if you deeply understand computationalism, you realize that it's actually unphysical, that there's all sorts of ways in which like it is incompatible with physics. Well, we are married actually to physics. I mean, we strongly think that, okay, mathematical physics is the correct lens with which to approach how to analyze the universe, and it predicts future states and makes sense of its ontology. But also we are idealists in the sense that we think that the thing that exists is consciousness. So there's many names for these, and like there's like subtle differences between them, but maybe for the purpose of this talk, they're sort of interchangeable. Another way of talking about this is dual aspect monism. This idea that there's actually just one thing, but it casts like different shadows. One of them is its behavior, another one it's its interior, lived experience.
Right.
So physics is describing experience from the outside. It's essentially how it behaves. But it's actually silent about what it's made of. And that's, what the science of consciousness is good for. And another term is panpsychism. Essentially, everything is conscious, but with a lot of asterisks and caveats, because we definitely don't think, for example, that a rock has a mind or something like that. If anything, a rock would be mind dust, like tiny, tiny, tiny specks of qualia scintillating and interrelating with each other, but never like coalescing into a unified experience of any sort. So.
Right, right. And I think, I would put panpsychism on a spectrum as well. You have constitutive panpsychism on one end, and then you have sort of Whiteheadian panpsychism on the other end, or even cosmopsychism. It might spread out into that. And I think people are less married to an atom, which is a discrete packet of actual existence, has an inner qualia. I think that's probably less popular than people who are more over on sort of the Whiteheadian end of the spectrum, at least a little bit that I've understood of any dialectics that I've come across. So in that consciousness, you are addressing phenomenal consciousness more than sort of the day-to-day access consciousness. Panpsychism plays a part in that. Now, it's interesting. I have been following Keith Frankish on Twitter, and he just loves goading people with the whole qualia thing. So let me play the devil's advocate for just a second, because I think there's space for everybody in this. But I love the way Keith is just so doggedly determined to just push people's buttons. But and there's an interview with James Cook that he's done. And prior to seeing the interview, I was like, oh, come on, Keith, come on, come on. But, I think the way he tries to explain qualia away is, I may not agree with it, but I think what he's saying is there's like a direct one-to-one mapping with the agent and what is external to the agent. And so that the qualia is an extra metaphysical step that I guess he thinks isn't necessary. And apologies to Keith Frankish and his cohort if I'm misrepresenting it. But so in that, I sort of come back and say, well, at the very least, just like everything that we deal with as experiential agents, qualia is a useful heuristic. It is a useful tool for us to share and exchange ideas with. So even if it doesn't deserve an extra metaphysical category, it's still vitally important, just like idealism is vitally important to convey an idea that maybe there is this primacy to consciousness, and it may not, in neutral monism, I keep on the table. I mean, because for me, it could come down to where it is not just pure consciousness that is the underlying ontological primitive. It is that it could be something beyond that we don't understand, that could be constituted of rather things that we just don't know. So anyway, I'm rambling and I'm on a tangent. I apologize. But so what do you say to something? And I think Dennett does that too, and you've referenced Dennett in other dialogues, that it's illusory and it's eliminativism is a good way to work with it. I even saw Patricia Churchland say something the other day about, I am not getting rid of consciousness, and I'm not, so where do you guys lie on that? Like, does qualia have this sort of really firm grounding in our, on the ontology of reality, or where are you with that? Is it just a heuristic?
No, I mean, I think everything that exists is actually qualia. I mean, like, so there's like many ways of approaching this, and like, I definitely can steel man illusionism, and like I think there's that's an interesting exercise, of course, but I don't actually think it's very insightful, precisely because there is so much fascinating low-hanging fruit to actually be obtained if you take consciousness seriously, and that is the sort of thing that we have encountered. Like, I mean, like making sense of like DMT realms, or making sense of jhanas on meditation and so on, is the sort of thing that, like, in practice, an illusionist is completely uninterested in, because they will think of those as, that's just scrambling your brain. There's nothing especially interesting about that. Another very key observation is that people who are eliminativists / illusionists, I mean, from a sociological point of view, usually they have introspective deficits, in that there are like some aspects of their experience they don't necessarily fully grok. But I think they're there. I mean, it's kind of like an access consciousness issue. And one of them that is absolutely essential is difficulty in recognizing the unity of consciousness, that actually, for anything to make sense at all, you actually need to present multiple pieces of information simultaneously. And, there's this very important question of like, okay, is consciousness as unified as it seems? And people like Daniel Dennett, they will present a lot of like visual illusions and thought experiments that, experiments, psychophysics experiments that show that we live under the delusion that consciousness is more unified than it is, or that we perceive information that actually isn't there. A very simple example is like if you enter a room where the wallpaper is made of Marilyn Monroe's, tessellated, but actually some of those Marilyn Monroe's are they have incomplete faces. They're not fully there. If you take a quick glance, you will kind of get this gestalt impression of like, oh, the entire wallpaper is just full of Marilyn Monroe's. But then when you investigate it more carefully, hey, actually, that part doesn't have a Marilyn Monroe. He would argue based on that, saying that, oh yeah, that illusion of the gestalt, that shows that unity was actually illusory because you weren't actually integrating all of that information. I mean, to that, what I would respond is that, no, the gestalt was unitary. It's just that, it was failing to incorporate like faithful information from the environment. And that's a very different thing. And it is absolutely the case that consciousness is less unified than we believe. But even the tiniest shred of unity that consciousness has would still need to be explained. And there is for sure a lot of unity in consciousness that essentially, challenges so many assumptions in neuroscience. One, I guess like a recent paper on illusionism by J.C. Rees, like, he distinguishes between consciousness like as self-reference versus consciousness as a property, and essentially concludes that, well, he can't think of a way in which consciousness could be a property, and so let's just like talk about it in terms of self-reference. And I think that's like very, very essentially misguided. First of all, because most of what matters in consciousness actually has very little to do with self-reference, in that you can have blind panic or intense pain, very little self-reference, but still very, very morally relevant states of consciousness. But then on the other hand, I do think there is such a thing as consciousness as a property. And the way to understand this is by understanding the binding problem. So essentially, what makes all of the qualia actually belong to the same category, right? Like you have like color qualia and smell qualia, audio theory qualia. They look so different, so disparate, and probably the result of like very different kinds of information processing. Mm-hmm. Why do they belong to the same category? For the simple reason that they can be part of a unified experience. And that property, the property of, hey, this can be a texture in an experience with every other texture, that makes it belong to that category. And why that category exists is something that, illusionism is not going to answer. And I think you need to actually postulate, yes, there is such a thing as consciousness that's investigated scientifically. And consciousness is not reducible to really just like piecewise understanding of like, oh, let's look at the algorithms for audio, the algorithms for vision and tactile sensation. No, because they actually all have to come together into a unified world simulation. And that is something that has this consciousness quality.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you've mentioned in other dialogues and interviews is that we may arrive someday at the conclusion, I guess, that consciousness is a field, much like our subatomic world, boils down or reduces down, if you want to go that way, to this field of potential of sort of a off-on binary things happening that present what we call materiality to our experience. And so I like that whether it's fully intended to be a concrete statement, or even if it's a metaphor, that it is a field, and maybe the direction you're heading in with mathematics and with algorithmic process, maybe, if I don't want to throw that in if it's not necessary, but that may help us again as a tool or a mapping device to understand the functionality of consciousness, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can comment on this. So, I mean, I think one of the, theoretical drives behind something like illusionism, eliminativism, I mean, it really is that, okay, if, like, first of all, there's very likely no quantum mechanical effects in the brain because it's too hot. So like, okay, like any kind of like quantum theories of consciousness, you might be able to rule them out. And so all you have in practice is classical physics, which says like, okay, well, you have a bunch of atoms together in the brain. So just by design, by the very ontology of this situation, the binding problem is actually unsolvable, right? It's like, how does all of these like atoms simultaneously contribute to a unified experience. Well, they can't, because they're actually spatiotemporally located in different regions of space-time. And in that sense, like whatever kind of unity that exists must be kind of some sort of like illusory algorithmic unity. Like it's just like it acts coherently, but it's not actually united in basement reality. But I think that's like actually underselling classical physics, because classical physics doesn't exactly say that the world is just made of atoms and forces. In a different way of looking at it is that it actually postulates that the world is made of fields.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual thing that exists is field configurations, and atoms, particles, are actually just tracking field properties. So one example of these is like, what is an electron? An electron has many, properties in addition to the one I'm going to mention. But one of the key properties is that it is a point where the divergence of the electric field is positive. So essentially, it's like a place where the field lines, from which the field lines emerge. And something like a proton would be the other way around, when field lines converge.
Okay.
So in a certain sense, you could say the existence of an electron or a proton is actually kind of illusory. The thing that is actually there is all of these field lines interrelated. And the electron is just a way of tracking information about how those field lines are related to each other. So even within just classical physics, you can say, yeah, the universe is made of fields. Particles are tracking information about the fields. And then you actually get a possible solution to the binding problem by realizing that the thing that you have to ask now is not how all these atoms come together to form a unified experience, but the other way around. How do you get a unified field to actually segment into individuals? And our solution at QRI is what we call a topological segmentation. And essentially, this is where the field lines essentially form a loop or a knot, such that if you're within that pocket and you follow the field lines, there's no escape. You're going to continue being in the same region. And this is a very active area of research in physics. I mean, you can look it up in Google Scholar. You will find it by the name of the cohomology studies of electromagnetism. And really, there's like a whole set of weird phenomena in physics that only make sense once you incorporate a topological understanding of the fields of physics as well. So my prediction, I mean, this is a very, very bold and in a way very strange prediction, is that with high enough accuracy electromagnetic imaging of the nervous system, we will actually see, in real time, the brain creating a topological pocket in the electromagnetic field. And that if you were to disrupt that pocket, you will also disrupt the state of consciousness and its properties.
Interesting. And so I guess I'll say one thing to back up a little bit to back to Keith Frankish for a minute. I think his brand of illusionism isn't quite the according to Hoyle illusionism, like the Churchland variety. And again, I may be doing a disservice to Patricia Churchland, so I apologize for that. In trying to understand what he's talking about, anyway, I'll leave it at that because I may not understand it enough. So the topology would then give license or the ability to do that mathematical charting, right? Is that where you can then find? So is there complementarity to the fields of that which we call materiality and the field that you're proposing that we call consciousness? And as such, and then you mentioned the word idealism earlier. So consciousness is fundamental. Perhaps we'll bracket it as a field, and so the interplay. So you're saying that there could be a parallel means of topological, again, maybe charting or mapping or mathematical connection to that to help mine it out and understand it. Are they relational? I guess the field of consciousness and the field of what we call materiality. Again, if we go back to neutral monism for a second, are they of the same kind of architecture, perhaps, that would produce a topology that you can recognize, if
I
that
mean,
helps? Sorry,
yeah,
sorry, it's painful for the get it out, but like I'm not an academic, so I have to ask these things kind of carefully.
no,
Bludgeon my way through it.
the claim is that the fields of physics are actually fields of sentience.
Okay,
So,
okay. And there,
yeah,
hence the panpsychism. Okay, cool. All right.
yeah.
So I was still dividing things, and so I apologize for that. Okay, good. Now I get it. It just clicked. So then obviously the topology would be one and the same.
Yeah.
And going to a different type of metaphysics, what are your thoughts on process relational metaphysics? That seems to be the flavor of the year right now, or the last 5 years. And I don't say that in a disparaging way, but a lot of great thinkers. Ian McGilchrist is really on with that, and Peter Shustet Hughes rather is into that. I had Matt Segal on, who's sort of the carrier of that Whiteheadian process metaphysics, and there's other types of process relational metaphysics. But anyway, so where do you guys? Does any of that jive with you guys?
So I mean, I would have like two issues with it. I mean, first of all, what is the boundary of a process? Right, and in a certain sense, kind of like a process philosophy of consciousness is fairly similar to something like functionalism in consciousness, that identifies, conscious experience with a particular, information processing that takes an input and delivers an output, or a particular function of experience. The problem with that is like there's no objective boundaries you can draw on it, and it actually is up for debate. There's no framing variance to it, meaning that, even from a very physical point of view, depending on how fast you're moving, a process may be on one step of a process might happen before another step of the process. Like essentially, there's no universal frame of simultaneity, and it really is like up for interpretation. Like what is the spatiotemporal boundary that defines like, okay, this was an event that happened that we can define as like a process that corresponds to an experience. So I don't see how they could answer the binding problem / boundary problem. But then there's like another critique, which is of a fairly different nature. And that is that, even if you say something like everything is made of change, like reality is kind of this changing flux. There's this concept in physics called a state space or a phase space, where essentially, if you want to describe, for example, the movement of an object in 3D, you can essentially do it with like 6 coordinates. I mean, like you can define it in terms of like where the object is with kind of 3 coordinates, and then with other 3 coordinates, you can define what is the speed, along each of the 3 dimensions. And so, yes, like in some sense, you could say like inherently the object is moving. And maybe like kind of this movement or this process is an inherent property of the object, and like that's part of its ontology. But then you could also say it's actually also just a static object that lives in 6 dimensions, where you also consider the movement as a property of the object itself. So in this sense, I'm not really convinced there's like something particularly ontologically new, because you can, to put it in a more formal mathematical sense, is like you can incorporate the derivatives of an object as properties of the object, and then get rid of the concept of a process. And then all you have is an object again. So in that sense, I very much side with this idea that consciousness is a thing and not a process. Susan Pocket has a pretty good article about this. It's exactly titled that way: Consciousness is a thing, not a process. It's a pretty good essay. I recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it. What I find, and I'm coming strictly from a naive, intuitive perspective, what I find appealing about not necessarily the process, but relationality or relational, I'll eliminate process and just call it relational metaphysics, is that, so if I am a conscious agent and I am interacting with the world, to use some of the Whiteheadian language, there's a draw to the next moment of experience, the throb of experience. And so it's more romantic and poetic, but it's appealing in an intuitive sense that the conscious agent experiencer is interacting with its environment, and that is processorial thing, but nonetheless, so it's not really getting into the meat of consciousness per se, but it's more the actionable day-to-day kind of experiential explanation of how we move forward through what we call time, so I find it appealing in that sense, that I am relating with ostensibly what we could define as a physical world as an observer, as a conscious experiential agent. So I find some poetic, romantic, again, intuitive sense there. And so that in its own right has value, but at the same time, if you really drill down into it, because I had Matt and Bernardo Kastrup on together, and so Bernardo has his thing, and he kind of laid it out that, well, it is a useful fiction per se necessarily, and that it because it really draws on sort of like Platonic ideas and a couple of other things, but again, I love it as a heuristic or a teaching aid, to help you just sort of make sense of how you fumble through reality. So
yeah,
maybe that's the great value in it, but to have it as an ontological primitive, I don't know. I don't go that far, but I like it as a sort of a intuitive nod to a particular thought of metaphysics, if that's the way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, you can think of this as kind of like talking about phenomenology, and in phenomenology, the feeling of change is really important. I mean, it's clearly a very, very central aspect of our experience. I have an article, it's called the Pseudo-Time Arrow, where I explain what I believe the quality of change is at a very fundamental level. And, you can actually play with it to some extent in meditation and psychedelics, what we call exotic phenomenal time, because people report that, right? Like on the psychedelic, they may experience like time loops. They feel like the moment that they're leaving is just kind of in an endless cycle, and like there's no way out of it, and like that can be pleasant or unpleasant depending on like the quality of that experience. But there's this feeling of like this will always be this way, it has always been this way.
Yeah.
And then there's also like other things. There's moments of eternity, which is like where time actually just completely stops. There's no feeling of change, and some people experience this in, for example, their visual field naturally after an accident. I forget if that's like called simultagnosia. There might be a slightly different disorder, but essentially all the experience is like still frozen images. They don't actually perceive them moving from one to another. They just experience like a car here, and then a car here, and then a car here. And yes, they remember that they were elsewhere, but they don't feel that change.
Right.
So to me, all of that is like an indication that like the feeling of change is a variable that corresponds to a property of experience, and it's very adaptive. It's helpful for evolutionary purposes, for computational purposes, but it's in no way like necessary for consciousness. You could, it may very well be, that maybe our post-human descendants will actually only experience like frozen experiences in time, and they will never actually experience any sense of change, because maybe change doesn't feel as good as just like frozen perfection or something like that. So that's something to mention. It's kind of like I would put in the umbrella of like a lot of metaphysical speculation is in a certain way trying to make sense of one's phenomenology. But then if you do that, you also should pay attention to exotic phenomenology that challenges the assumptions that you may believe that, hey, every experience has this property, because oftentimes that's just not the case.
Yeah. And certainly psychedelics are a prime candidate for that kind of skepticism, I would think.
Yep. Oh, yes. Psychedelics, dissociatives, meditative states, mental illness and brain damage. Yeah, all of them provide incredible counterexamples.
Yeah, absolutely. I can remember a particular LSD trip that I took when I was 17, and I was bad 17-year-old. I was driving, and a caveat to all you young people: do not ever drive under the influence of anything. But I remember pulling up to an intersection, and a city bus was going by, and I mapped it for a second, and then the bus just stretched almost for an eternity. It was like the longest bus ever, and I saw no end and no beginning of the bus for probably what it was in real time, about 5 seconds. But again, things just locked up for a second, and I'm at the wheel of a car and I'm like, I should not be doing this, even at my dumb, stupid 17. But it eventually the back end, and it was a lot like and we used to call them trails. I don't know what, if tracers or things like that. It was similar to that, where you get like you said, the fractal, like the frames of a film, and it sticks on a particular frame where everything's stopped. But it did that, and it was remarkable again because it was a dilation of the physical object. And then again, it resumed itself. And for some reason, I was still able to drive across town and get done what I had to do. But that was, again, nobody ever do that. But I'm just reporting that as an experience of something similar to what you're describing there.
No, it's exactly right. I mean, this is definitely a rabbit hole, but I can mention some things about this. So it's exactly with essentially like spatiotemporally repeating patterns. On psychedelics, they can be like, essentially like completed. I mean, there's this phenomenon, we call it lowering the threshold for symmetry detection, where like usually, like if there's like 5 dots here and like there's one missing and then like 5 dots here, you realize, there's like a dot missing, and your visual field renders that properly. But on a psychedelic, it may overcomplete it. And like, it's like, it pattern matches this spatial frequency, and then like it creates the illusion of an extra dot where there shouldn't be one. And essentially, this kind of like completion of symmetries becomes like pretty abundant on psychedelics. At first, on small doses, that can actually be beneficial for some information processing, in that like if there was actually a symmetry there that you were just like not perceiving. Sometimes with a psychedelic, it's like, like it kind of highlights it, and like, this is real, but maybe kind of subtle or like a little bit noisy. On high doses of psychedelics, you get like fully hallucinatory symmetries that are just not there in the sensory input at all, right? Like you can look at a texture of a wall or something, and it will tessellate in a very crazy way that has nothing to do with the actual texture in the wall. And that happens both in space with like symmetrical pattern repetition, and in time, where you get like these time slices that like loop and loop and loop. And PRI is actually, as far as I know, like the only organization that has like taken these very seriously. And we essentially create a tool that is called the tracer tool, which is essentially it's kind of like a Photoshop for visual tracers. And if anybody, I'm not encouraging you to take substances, but like if you are psychedelic in the future and you want to donate a data point by donating 5 minutes of your time, definitely check out the site and like look at the bouncing ball while you're tripping, and really like pay attention to the tracer pattern and then try to reproduce it. And any data point will continue to help the research here.
Okay, all right. Well, gosh, 30 something years ago, I would have been more than happy to be a guinea pig, because my friends and I were kamikazes, and we would have been good fodder for that. And it's been almost 30 years since I've taken any, mushrooms, no, but acid, yes. I think at 93 was the last time I dropped, and haven't done it since. And I did mushrooms in the early 2000s was the last time. I did a reasonable dose. It wasn't threshold. It wasn't full-on hallucinations, but alas, anyway. And I may revisit someday. I had a brain injury a few years ago, and it's left me intolerant of anything psychoactive, which is like the coolest thing you can do to me. It's like, I mean, in a way, it was like nature's intervention, because I'm a hedonist, and so I am not inhibited in any way. In fact, prior to whatever cortical restraint I had, you put something in front of me, and I'd be happy to do it. I knew my pharmacology, so I wouldn't do stupid things, but I was always eager to go and have fun with everybody and stuff like that. In fact, I'll share something with you that you could maybe help process a little bit. And I had an interview with James Cook, who is very much into psychedelic assisted therapy, and he has his channel on YouTube. And I was telling him about a phencyclidine or a PCP experience that I had one time, and I did a very, very high dose unwittingly, and I did full exteriorization. And so I remember about a year ago, Michael Shermer was talking to a guest, and he was talking about how they've tried to explain away exteriorization as sort of our sense organs are mapping the room constantly. We've got this, this three-dimensional profiling going on. And he sort of said that, in the 50s, when they were giving phencyclidine as a general anesthetic and people were floating over their bodies while in surgery, freaked him out. And he said, well, it's a kind of, not proprioception, it's just a kind of a weird perceptual thing. And they didn't really explain whether eyes were open or not. So, maybe the room was mapped prior to going under anesthesia and you have this full perspective of the room. But anyway, it seemed very real because the multiple times that I left my body on that substance, including the first time when I was walking down the hallway and I turned around and looked at my body and said, let's go, we're late for class, very matter-of-factly, not thinking about the fact that I'm not present in my own physical body, but I actually had a conversation with the body and I said, come on, hurry up, we're going to be late for world history or whatever it was. And then in the classroom, I was pretty much over the classroom for about a third of the period of the class, and I'd pop back in. And the leaving process was very remarkable in the sense that it was this kind of rushing, whooshing. There's no audio behind it, but it was just this. You felt like you were being propelled out, and it wasn't comfortable. It didn't feel good. And then you're out, and then you kind of come back in and everything's fine, except you're incredibly high. And then that happened like half a dozen times where I popped out. So what do you guys think about exteriorization and the fact that I could fully report seeing over, microphone pop, everybody's head? I could see me. And we were doing a quiz that day and I was filling out the paperwork, there's still some part of me functioning down there in the chair. But so what do you guys think about that? To me, that's just one of the more extraordinary experiences. I don't tie anything supernatural into it at all. I think there's, some grounding reason why we experience things that way. So I'll shut up and let you share.
No, it's a great question. I mean, definitely there's two big categories of explanation spaces here. I mean, one for sure is like in the category of like remote viewing or something like that, which I don't tend to explore. I mean, I consider it fairly unlikely. I don't discard it. And there's like some pretty extraordinary reports out there that like, need explaining. But it is pretty clear to me though, that we do make essentially what's called an amodal mapping of our environment. And that's kind of like a different part of the brain. I mean, they talk about grid cells essentially taking charge of like mapping the environment.
Okay.
And we have kind of like that map embedded in our brain while we inhabit a room, inhabit a space. And then you have other parts of the brain that are interacting with that map in a way that is, depending on the particular phase, you interact with a different projection of that map. And in that sense, once you have kind of like captured the rough outline of a particular place, you can, in a sense, like dissociate from like your current belief in your location in that place and experience that place from other points of view, as long as, in principle, you maintain the same level of, phase coherence with the grid cells so that you continue to render it coherently.
Okay.
And I mean, definitely one of the places where I know that like this happens with fairly high reliability is dissociatives, but especially DXM for some reason. Like it's a very common report that like if you take something in the order of like 400 to 600 milligrams for an adult, you oftentimes like, you close your eyes and like it feels like you're still seeing through your eyelids.
Yeah.
And also you can like walk around and see your room from like different perspectives, and all the while you're in the bed. And at some point like you move your body and like you realize like, oh shit, I was actually like in the bed, like very heavily dissociated. But something that to me is also kind of like a strong hint that this is actually hallucinatory. I mean, you're making predictions. You're going to make predictions of like what is the most likely thing that is going on externally, because our brains are prediction error minimizers. So yes, he's going to try to make it realistic. He's going to try to make it plausible, and it's going to connect the sounds, for example, that you're hearing with the hallucinatory content to kind of like make it multimodally matched. The brain also dislikes when sensory modalities are actually mismatched. So like we're trying to minimize like what's called like cross-modal prediction errors, where like something doesn't make sense in modalities are incoherent. So there's a lot of reasons why the hallucinatory content would look pretty realistic, or like as realistic as the brain can essentially make it. But there is like one maybe that giveaway that this is hallucinatory content, and I might need to eat a hat or something if it turns out that this is all remote viewing and I'm just just like teaching that
I
possibility. But
yeah, no, I like to stay grounded, in the sort of naturalist framework. So I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, because I don't think there's whatever. Anyway, so I keep remote viewing on the table, and even what are they? Just sort of impressions from potentials, people who want to think they're psychics or whatever. I don't fully dismiss it, because I think the future is potentials, and potentials come to a point at some point. So maybe some people can intuit things. So I'm always I'm agnostic. I don't poo-poo things too hard. But so remote viewing, it's on the table, but I'm not going to focus on it too much.
So Stephen Lehar, a great cognitive scientist, I write about. I mean, he's a friend, and he's really funny, really excellent thinker. He has a book called The Grand Illusion, where essentially he outlines. This is you can find it in a PDF online. It's a short book, like 100 pages. I recommend anybody interested in consciousness to read it, because it's like essentially the best account I know of like drug experiences by somebody who's like philosophically very talented. Like he's really trying to make sense of like his LSD and PCP and DXM experiences and stuff like that. And I mean, he talks about like how on DXM he was able to like look at his room, look at other places, and actually like voluntarily create fully multimodally coherent hallucinations at will. He called them freewheeling hallucinations, where essentially you can create, you ask your brain, I want to see a table, and like it materializes a table in front of you, and you can see it from different angles. And DXM alone may not do it. You might need a little bit of weed, the synergy for that to happen.
Okay.
But I mean, essentially that can happen. But at that give a way that, this is not like accessing other realms, but it's actually hallucinatory content, is the information content of these hallucinations is bounded. So like he was describing how he was like imagining himself being on an airplane, for example. He's a pilot. He has like a small plane and likes to pilot it around. And he would like kind of like create these scenarios where he's in World War II or something, like a fighter jet or something. And, just having fun in kind of like this, I guess, like flight simulator made on his DXM experience.
Oh, wow. That's cool. That's neat.
Yeah. And, but he would look at the control panel, and like every time the control panel would lack some buttons. Like the fidelity of the simulation that he was making just was not high enough to include all of the details that the control panel actually has. And I think that this is going to be really important to study well in the future, is like, what is the, information fidelity or information content, bandwidth or upper bound of these hallucinations. And my guess is that by and large, if you enter a freewheeling hallucination, the information content would be strictly less than actual experiences rendered from sensory input. Like there's going to be, for example, things are going to be like overcompleted with symmetries and patterns or harmonic resonance. Surfaces will look very intricate and detailed, but then when you examine them carefully, they're actually just like a tessellation, or they're like a little fractal. And in that sense, they actually have like very little information. They're just like a little simple process that is repeating a lot. So you can estimate kind of what is the information content of an experience in terms of like, okay, how many patterns of resonance do you need to stack together to create the scene? And my strong guess is that, the PCP experience and things like that essentially have just lower information content, and they don't actually represent as much information as real life, as it were.
Okay. I have to say, I must have been gypped when I did a hero's dose of DXM one time, and the only thing that came from it, and this was born out of stupidity when I was in this session, it felt as though my head, when your arm falls asleep and you get the tingling of the ants, my whole head felt like that. And there was nothing like positive valence at all. No, bliss or anything. I was just not having a good day. And it was my fault because I drank a 4-ounce bottle of whatever Robitussin, and I thought, okay, and I'd done that dozens of times, and I thought, oh yeah, here it's gonna be another Saturday with Robo, or whatever. And then nothing happened after the typical come up time. And I thought, well, shit, what am I going to do? And maybe I'm a hard head now. Maybe I'm used to it. Drank another 4-ounce bottle of rum. I thought, oh, that'll do it. And no, that was not cool. It wasn't like I have to go to the hospital kind of thing. It just, and I probably had to make myself sit in this situation to realize what a stupid thing I had done. And I don't even know how many milligrams of DXM that was. But like I said, the only thing I could report from that was very physiological. There was nothing psychotropic, nothing profound experientially that came from that, other than just being very in a state of discomfort. It might have been because of the gefenicin that was adjuvant to that, which is an expectorant. So maybe something was going on with an overdose, because God knows how many times overdose I did of DXM, but there was also that gefenicin or whatever it's called on board.
Yeah, you've got to. I mean, that's definitely a public service announcement. Like,
yeah,
always get your DXM pure.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I was about 22, so again, stupid. Not Oh, do you have is there?
Yeah, like one of these. You can get the generic formulation at Walgreens.
It's absent of gefenicin, or however you pronounce that.
Yeah, it's just pure.
Oh, okay.
Pure DXM. I don't know if you can see it.
I always enjoyed low dose DXM. It was, I wasn't smoking pot at the time. And so it was kind of like, not an analog, but it was just a nice recreational thing to chill out with for about 4 hours. For me.
So that's I think people, well, generally we have like very heavy categories for like what things are for. And okay, South, the existentialists are all about like, what is it like, essence
existence precedes essence or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So essentially we develop like functional fixedness, right? It's like, okay, no, like this drug is for this particular purpose. We saw this with COVID with for example luvoxamine, which is like an SSRI, actually having like the possibility of reducing probability of hospitalization by like 30%, which is actually really, really significant when you think of how many people it can save. But then, a lot of people were very resistant to that information. It's kind of like, well, that's just an antidepressant, right? It's on the label. It's an antidepressant. It's not like an antiviral or something like that. Well, so the same thing like with DXM. So like DXM, it's used as a cough suppressant. Okay, like that's one use. And then it's used for tripping in high doses. But they are actually nowadays like realizing that you can actually use it to enhance ADHD medication.
Oh, really?
I'm actually not so sure about like how sustainable and like healthy that is, because Ritalin or Adderall are already going to be taxing your cardiovascular system, and then if you add DXM to that, I don't think it's very healthy for your heart in the long term.
Yeah.
But they do show like fascinating like results based on that. And my personal experience with like small dose DXM, we're talking like 30 milligrams, is that it works as an kind of like an ADHD medication. Like if you really need to write an essay or something, like taking 30 milligrams of DXM might actually make you wired in a fairly lucid way for like 5 hours or something like that. So, and it's fairly safe at those dosages. I wouldn't be concerned. And I think I would be much more concerned, if a friend was like using Adderall regularly to write essays as opposed to like DXM. Actually, I would be much more concerned.
Yeah, I've abused Adderall, and we used to grind it up and snort it. And I never really, other than being able to do physical work, I never got much from it. Like, and again, I want to say this to the audience. I'm not advocating drug use at all. I've got a history, and I was never addicted to anything, but I sure as hell abused drugs. And I don't want anybody to get the idea that I'm romanticizing or glamorizing any kind of substance. Do your research, have your ethical compass lined up. Do not take any advice from me, and I think I speak for Andrés as well. So having said that, I didn't really get much satisfaction from Adderall because they take the dopaminergic essence out of it. So something like what's the thing they give pilots? The
Modafinil? No.
no, it's just a regular amphetamine, but it's dextroamphetamine. I found that with that little dopaminergic kick to it, that I was able to focus, and also methamphetamine, which I didn't do much of because I don't like being jacked for that long. But I found that I could focus, and I am very much ADD. And so if I did, and we would do anhydrous intranasally. And so if you smoke anhydrous, you're up for 3 days. If you snort it, it's an anhydrous. And so it's not going to bind as well. And we found that you could get about 6 or 8 hours of, whatever it is you need to do. And I've done landscaping for the last 20 something years. So if I had a job, I really, so we would do a little of that. And when it was available, and you could go out and get focused. And like I said, I'm not advocating the use of methamphetamine. It is a highly problematic drug. But just to add to the conversation, that was something that I noticed if I had done that I could really zero in, get convergent focus, get something done. If it was super tedious, it wasn't a problem, and move through that. I also found like things like OxyContin were the same way, because I think narcotics, opiates, are on a spectrum just like marijuana. So like you have a high THC, low CBD marijuana, like a sativa, tropical sativa, and a sort of couch-locky, Nepalese kind of indica race or Afghani race that I think the same thing happens for me with opiates. Like if OxyContin or codeine is on board, then you're going to go out and work and be able to do your thing. And if you do heroin or methadone or something like that you're going to be just shot for the day. And you don't make a lot of plans for, whatever it is that you're going to do. So anyway, it's interesting how the affect is different, even though they're or the same, rather, I guess, with different drugs. So anyway.
Probably the dopaminergic loading of something like OxyContin might be much higher than methadone or something.
And again, I could just and again, not advocating, but just I could go out and get stuff done. And if I took methadone, which I did a few times, I'd rather just sit and read or be at a party. I mean, it was a social lubricant. It's like alcohol. You just, you just chill and, you're going to do this. But with that other, what branch is that? The morphine branch? No, it's anyway, whatever branch that OxyContin, oxycodone comes off of. It's much more about getting out and working and so forth.
Interesting.
Doing stuff anyway. That's my limited experience. I didn't abuse that stuff too much, but I think because I'm a curious sort, so I had friends in fact, this is another conversation. I had friends that were psychonauts, and I could tell you some stories about, they've been doing it. They were deadheads. They've been doing it since the early 70s. And they had stories about mirazine and all these really exotic, weird things where you just really go out to other realities. And he had a story of a friend of his that had another life in mirazine land or wherever, and mirazine was a motion sickness pill. I don't think it exists anymore. If you did a 30 times overdose or something, you were gone. And it was, several hours. It was complete, like ibogaine, is just complete detachment from here. But anyway, so I've just got we're probably coming up on about an hour and 20 minutes. I've got a little bit of time with you, and if we could switch gears, and we definitely need to come back and have a second conversation, because with the little bit of time that we have, I want to talk maybe a little bit about technology. And then in another conversation, I want to talk to you about ethics and sociology and, human stigmergy and all these kind of things when it comes to what you guys are doing. That's another hour and a half right there. So, so let me just broach and dip our toes in the water of tech. And I think of, sorry, it's going to take a second just to bring her name up. Why am I forgetting her name? She's an MIT graduate. For goodness sakes, I had her name in my head. She follows you on Twitter. Anyway, she developed, and it'll pop back in. She developed a interactive virtual reality system that can simulate psychokinesis and things like that. So it's using brainwaves interaction with the program that she developed at MIT. And what do you guys think about Judith Amores Fernandez? Sorry, took me a few minutes. Judith Morris Fernandez. If you're not familiar with her work, she's and again, she follows you on Twitter. So she had this thing, and you can go to her website and you can see where just by thought alone, you can, in virtual reality, you can make things levitate, you can make walls disappear, you can do all these kind of things. Outside of Technotopia, I mean, what do you guys see as a utilitarian augmented reality and virtual reality as being able to, if anything, a gentler analog to all the crazy shit we were just talking about with drugs, to help folks like myself? Like I can drink coffee and that's about it anymore, because I had a mold sickness injury that just screwed up my GABA receptors somehow.
Oh, okay.
So anything, alcohol, marijuana, narcotics, I can't take any of it. In fact, I have to take propofol for a colonoscopy, and I'm terrified of what propofol might do. And I'm going to talk to them about that, because I don't want to take propofol, because that's like GABAergic. You know, it just blocks right into your GABA receptor. Anyway, I'm on another tangent. What do you think about virtual reality, augmented reality? Maybe not so much with QRI, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, like I mean, first of all, I think most people in the future will probably be engaging with those technologies a lot more than they are today. And I think it's just going to be very, very ubiquitous. But I mean, in the end, like, we will very quickly realize like all their limitations. And in particular, they don't actually recalibrate the hedonic set point. I mean, like, I mean, it's kind of like you can have access to all the art that you want. You can have access to all the sex you want, even all the drugs you want. And not necessarily, but broadly speaking, you can have access to like virtual worlds, the metaverse, even controlling it with your brain and like be highly entertained for a while, but eventually it'll get boring. So in that sense, I think it's transformative when it comes to like capacity to increase the information bandwidth between people and between, you know, people and AIs. But it's not necessarily as transformative when it comes to actually increasing the quality of human experience. For that, I think like the most promising area is actually hedonic recalibration. And that's where, I mean, I hesitated to say like not all the drugs you want, because I mean, I think as I explained in my TED Talk, which hopefully will be online pretty soon, there is a new generation of drugs that will allow us to hack the physiological habituation mechanism that makes, you know, essentially the hedonic treadmill work the way it does, with, you know, leading forerunners being things such as like ibogaine and flumazenil that seem to be capable of actually reversing tolerance to other substances. So, I mean, to essentially recalibrate the hedonic set point at the biochemical level, I'm definitely envisioning things such as like a modified, you know, safer version of ibogaine together with like a partial mu opioid agonist. That might be kind of like the sort of combo that in principle you may be able to take and you will just never get used to it. And I think that's just going to revolutionize how we treat anxiety, how we treat depression, how we treat chronic pain, and even how we treat like dysthymia, just like regular people who are not depressed but are just bored and like unhappy in general.
Right.
But that's just at the biochemical level. At the neurotechnology level, I mean, the sort of thing that we work on at QRI, that maybe I've mentioned to you elsewhere a little bit, which is like, light, sound, and body vibration. It is specifically not for the purpose of just creating beautiful experiences, because beautiful experiences, you get used to them. I mean, again, like every once in a while is like really essential to experience sensory novelty. I mean, I advocate for smelling fun perfumes like often, and also like having, you know, going to, you know, wildlife like and parks and amusement parks. Like you do require novelty. Like our organism requires novelty of high quality, not just you know, endless scrolling on social media. But like, you know, high quality 3-dimensional novelty is important. It's important, but it is not sufficient for example, tackling something like depression or something like that. So instead, the thing that we think is actually much more promising is technology that actually interfaces with valence more directly. And in particular, things that allow us to reset our current hedonic set point. And a very, very promising kind of a overarching theoretical approach that we are pioneering is this whole concept of neural annealing. And my co-founder, Mike Johnson, he has this article about neural annealing. I mean, it came out from a lot of conversations that we had. And I introduced the term like in 2016 or something like that. But then, he fleshed it out and like put it up in a write-up. And it's very excellent. I highly recommend reading that essay. And then I also wrote an essay called Healing Trauma with Neural Annealing, which is kind of like taking it further. And it's, okay, using this paradigm, how do you heal like, deep-seated, trauma or like pain that you've developed. And it's not through just beautiful experiences. It's not through engaging experiences. It's a different mechanism. Essentially, it's like using these exotic altered states of consciousness that are highly energized, but are like essentially your nervous system is much more malleable in those states of consciousness, and you can overcome energy barriers, and you can dissipate internal stress that is like stored by getting other parts of your nervous system to process it. So that is what I think is actually going to be much more revolutionary than like enhanced reality or virtual reality, even if it has like neurofeedback involved.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a good metaphor is taking consciousness to a plasma state, whether it's psychedelics or synergistics to psychedelics, and I like that analogy because like you said in another talk, that sort of the lattice of the crystals sort of line up in a way that makes it, you come back and then you're reconfigured, so to speak, a little bit differently. Yeah. So my take or my reason for bringing up VR and AR is more at least an excuse me, complementarity and entry point, so that people, because you have to admit, psychedelics are not for everybody, and so microdosing is very fashionable, and I advocate that 100%. All the caveats I applied earlier, like if we can get to a place where CVS and Walgreens, and I hate to corporatize things, but you can go somewhere and with the doctors, it's a class 3, and you can go in and you can get small doses of whatever. I encourage that because I think there's so much. There's so many good outcomes coming from that, and it's not going to, and unless you're stupid and you eat the whole bottle, and then you're doing a strong 5-MeO and you're shot out of a cannon. Don't do that. Just go for the smaller serotonin receptor boosts, and go anyway. So I think, and so entry point, and for those who are less ambitious, for that stronger the annealing process. That they could work up the courage to do that, because the way I see VR, and I have a VR system back, that's a real fast gaming computer, and I do VR a little bit, and so I'm so impressed with sensory hijacking, and so it's only 2 senses, it's the auditory and the visual, but with a little bit of ingenuity, you could do also tactile, not complete hijacking or complete manipulation, but if you want to create the sensation like you're being thrust up, you could get a chair that could do certain things. You could the somatic potential is there, I think, or the interaction with the physical. So I just see that perhaps as a means of getting people to be curious about going to the next step and being open to the idea, because again, it's very intimidating, and of course there's a lot of social stigma, cultural stigma to psychedelics even in this day and age. I mean, there's still people like us are cool with it, and there is a renaissance going on, etc. But anyway, I just think it might be as they say in the anti-drug, it's like a gateway, to get you to maybe try some of the bolder things to get through trauma and to get through, where depression and anxiety have a grip on you, and anhedonic, perpetual and chronic, pathological anhedonic, states of being can be overcome. So anyway, and I say that because if I had the funding, I would go in and find somebody that, what is it, Python or whatever they write for the code that they do for VR. And let's just experiment. Let's get certain audio frequencies and certain visual things going that can trigger, because we can do weird stuff to people's brains with, just visual and audio stuff. And I think, anyway, I see potential there, but not to the totality of what you're talking about. And I can see that 100%. But I think as an entry point, that it's a good way of whetting someone's appetite and saying, see, we just did this, and here's this, and they can go to QRI from there, or wherever it is they need to go. So,
That's a hilarious framework, like taking seriously like the idea of a gateway experience.
yeah, in a
Getting
positive
people
way.
in a positive way.
That
Yes,
garbage,
I like it.
yeah, the garbage they used to spew about, sugar's a gateway drug, people. Come on.
Oh yeah.
Anyway. So yeah, I can't help but think, and like I said, who knows, maybe someday I will have the financial resources to pursue that and get with people who are much smarter and like, again, that Judith Morris Fernandez totally switched my light on with this thing with her psychokinesis simulation. So, I mean, if you can just by thinking lift the candle, and I'll send you the website to her thing, and she's got little YouTube videos of what she's done. Just the potential there. Again, it's at a tier. It's not going in the direction that you guys have gone, but it's at a tier that I think could be helpful. I think it could have some means of encouraging people to begin the journey. Of self-exploration and all that. So how are you? Are you good? Do you need to get going?
No,
we're right at an hour and a half.
I think I mean, like in 5 minutes or something like that.
Okay, let's begin to wind things down. And dude, I could totally have you back for, again, sociology and ethics and Buddhism and the other spiritual traditions. I have this thing, and it's nothing new. I just call it like a will to spirit. Like, do we, like we have this innate drive in us, just like the will to power, the will to sex, the will to meaning, all these other wills that come up. I think there is a will to not necessarily a transcendent spirituality, but the conscious. What I consider spirituality is the psyche, almost literally the Greek mythological psyche. The mind is, to me, is the spirit. It's our imagination. It is our capability of taking a white canvas and putting a beautiful painting on it to generate a musical piece. I think that's what that for me is what spirituality is. And so the will to spirit, if it can be confined to something within that house of that bracket of natural, accessible and not reaching towards, far off things and stuff like that, that we can expand that more. And psychedelics are certainly a way to do that. But, just acknowledging that the spirit is essentially the mind, and the psyche. And I think that's powerful in its own right. And then you can add on whatever you want, as long as you don't get too convicted about it. And that can cause problems in its own right. So
yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I can say my brief description of what I think, like, well, my spirituality is, and like, the sort of way in which I think about it. And I do think also of it as like the source of ethics, which is a very simple thing. It's like essentially a combination of these two factors. The first one is open individualism, which is this idea that on a very deep level, we're all interconnected. We're all like part of the same, I mean, in a very, very literal sense, I think we're all part of the same field of consciousness. We're just like different pockets of that same field. So yeah, this concept of individuality is, there's two sides of the same coin, but essentially it's like the deep truth is actually we're the field. And then on the surface level, we're these individuals in the field. And I think like that's a truth. And ultimately, I think it will be found through science. And is sufficiently advanced, like in general, sentient intelligence should be able to infer that, I think. And then the second element is valence realism. Essentially, this idea that once you've investigated all the possibilities of like what could be the source of what matters, it turns out that it is like whether experiences feel good or bad. Because like, I can present arguments where like, yeah, people who argue that like, hey, like what matters is meaning or something like that. They may actually not be introspecting enough about like why they care about meaning. And in the end, yeah, it turns out that like highly meaningful experiences turn out to be like very hedonically positive in ways that are like maybe not obvious. It's not like the same pleasure as like eating sugar, but it is a certain kind of, pleasure of a certain sort, having a very meaningful experience. And so I think like when you combine these two, like, hey, we're all one on a very, very deep level. And then two, what matters is valence. You essentially can get like value alignment. Essentially, it is kind of a formula for people to, have a foundation upon which, we can make decisions and we can resolve disagreements and maybe even align AIs potentially. So anyway, I think of that as both, spirituality and a source of ethics.
No, and I think they're intertwined because there is, to me, ethics, there's a sort of deontological ethics and the oughts and shalls and things like that, but there's also the ethics of compassion and empathy, and that runs through us. And so the unitary nature of the oneness of being can be bound by that. And yeah, I completely agree. And I use an analogy for people who kind of give me a blank stare when I say something like that. It's like, if you think about your physical body, it's made up of nitrogen and carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, and you are the universe, and not in a new age hippie kind of way. You are not distinct and separate from the constituents of the physical universe, as we call it. And so you can translate that as metaphor to what you and I agree is probably the primacy of consciousness, and that we are all sort of unitary in that sense as well. And then it gives you that, if you couple that with sort of Buddhist non-self thinking, that self is paradoxically both illusory and real at the same time, that you can feel, if you do your annealing, your neuro annealing, that you feel this sense of obligation to be compassionate to others and to balance selfishness with selflessness. And that's one of my biggest things, is like everything can be kind of seen on a spectrum, and so tuning things in within that spectrum, because we tend to think very much in a binary sense. And I'm old enough to know life before computers and the internet and things like that, and I think our interacting with binary language and things like that, and it's not conscious interaction, but I think things tend to be seen as one or the other, and what's in between is less meaningful. And so I think that's part of it too, is this tuning process that goes on with these kind of things, so that you don't become subject to conviction or a dogma or orthodoxy, and that you can be in a more of a fluid state of interaction with others and cultural normatives, and opening things up a little bit. And I think, again, if we are absent our traumas so that we don't project, and we are absent of egoic overinflation, that opens a lot of doors to just the facilitation of compassion and the facilitation of cooperation and things like that. And the other thing that I'm a little strange in my own right is that rather than seeking pleasure or a positive hedonic state, I would seek the state of ataraxia or equanimity, or this sort of, again, on the spectrum, where you are, the potential for hedonic and pleasurable experience is more available to you. And so that if you can stay in that state without the roller coaster, without the binary thing going, that it facilitates that ability to let hedonic experience happen naturally rather than pursuing it. And so that may not flush out with other folks the way they think and do things, but that's just one thing I experiment with, is to just have the capacity and the potential through ataraxia, or whatever you want to call it, through that stable sense of social resilience, or whatever you want to call it, that keeps you in that place where you can be open to a beautiful experience or a loving experience, and recognize it when it happens, and recognize an exchange with somebody as positive valence, as the affect is good, and therefore it just binds to a social net, the Indra's net, or whatever you want to call it. So we could go forever on that, but that's just me. I just think so. That's what I love what you guys are doing, is I think you're on a really good mission. I think you're really exploring territory that absolutely needs to be explored, because there's days I get up and I'm like, dude, we're screwed. We are totally screwed, and we've gone too far with not knowing how to manage ourselves with tech and with global village. Suddenly everybody's exposed to everybody else, and anonymity breeds this, and conviction breeds that, and misinformation breeds this and that. I think we're in that learning curve. We're in that bottleneck right now of trying to figure out how to manage this incredible technological leap that we've taken in just a generation and a half or 2 generations. And so what you guys are doing is absolutely critical at this point. And I have hope. I don't think anything's set in stone as far as this going off the deep end. But I think we need some of that going off the deep end to hopefully pull back and say, what are we doing? This isn't working. And so when you guys are there and the salience arises, and you guys can help be part of that that system and that team and that network that can get people back from the edge a little bit. So I'm lauding praises on you, and
thank you.
yeah, and your team, of course, and I want you back for a second interview. If this was good for you, I want to bring you back, and we'll have a conversation. Like I said, we could talk about wisdom traditions and how they enmesh themselves with what you guys are doing, as well as how this plays out, how it rolls out, kind of a la what I just said a minute ago. Like, people are crashing right now. People are really crashing. And you mentioned a lot about physical, somatic pain, and also we could talk about the psychosocial and psychospiritual pain that's going on. Again, with the thrusting of technology at us, and we weren't quite ready for it. It was like a good hard punch to the jaw. We were like, oh wait, and there's a lot. And I'm not beating up tech too much. I'm just saying that it's got a shadow and a light, and I think the shadow has kind of sucker punched us a little bit, and the light's still there. There's still so many amazing things that have come. And I mean, because I'm singing the praises of VR and AR. AR not so much. I think AR has a utility, but it's not for what we're talking about. So anyway, I'll shut up for a second and let you do a finishing remark. I wanted to give you guys some like atta people, atta persons, because I just, like I said, when I came across your work, I was like, yeah, this is cool. This is cool. I was skeptical too, I'm like, okay, does this, and so whatever, it doesn't matter.
That's funny.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up and let you do a finishing.
No, this is good. Thank you so much for all the encouragement and very kind words and positivity. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, maybe just to end on a positive note. I mean, I think we are very much on the brink of a world without either severe or chronic physical pain. And, I think, at QRI, that is one of our core missions. It's not the only one for deep reasons. I mean, one of them is that if you only think about, how to prevent extreme pain, that's a recipe for a burnout, essentially. So yeah, I also focus on other things as well, but no, I mean, I think it's imminent, and I think somebody has to make it happen. So like, if people are like really passionate about this and want to help, definitely reach out. You can either donate to QRI, or potentially you can volunteer, or even like apply for a job, and we can figure something out. And it's gonna be incredible. It's gonna be similar to anesthesia, that like people used to be completely learn helplessness. It's like, of course you're gonna experience an appendectomy without anesthesia, right? Like, it's just part of the deal. But like, it turns out that's just not the case. It turns out, you can actually go in general anesthesia and not having to endure that. The same is going to be for like, I think, other varieties of extreme pain. We just need to push those technologies, and there's already some really strong leads. So let's make that happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's great that you are tackling physical pain, because I think that just goes, it's, I don't know if it's some perverse stoicism that we seem to have, but it's like, we subject ourselves. And, the other thing that, and I do watch Bernardo Kastrup's work, is he talks about this idea that you live with pain. And I have this too. I've got all kinds of stuff, and you don't notice it. And until it becomes really obnoxious, and then it ramps up from a 2 to a 7 all of a sudden, and you're like, where the hell did that come from? Because I have like cervical arthritis, and I get headaches that are very similar to migraines, and I had terrible migraines as a child that would strike like clockwork, and it took 18 hours to get through it. And these are very this is like a 2 out of 10 for that, but it's still very disabling. It's like, oh shit, so but I don't really notice it. I just trudge through it. But if I could eliminate that, that would be great, because then I may not have that shitty day, and be able to be even more whatever it is I do, trying to be happy and positive and things like that. So what you guys are doing, tackling, even if it's 30% of the population, that's huge, or, I don't say even, it's even 10%. These percentages are meaningful and they're significant. I think you give, and I say this because you give statistics on like kidney stones and people with cluster headaches, and this, the RX segment of the population, and it needs to happen in that regard, because that's just that much more allyship that we get with people who say, hey, great, I'm not dealing with this, and this frees my time up to be more of a what we've been talking about, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, and again, when we get into the psychosocial and psychospiritual aspect of that, if you guys, I don't know if you guys would pivot to that, but if that happens in a similar vein, that dealing with anxiety and depression, and dealing with low-level psychosis, or whatever it is you want to talk about, that prevents people from being in that state of either anywhere from equanimity up to full, sort of blissful living, where they are really genuinely happy and genuinely switched on and alive with life. That's a admirable ambition, for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you
for
so
sure.
much. Thank you so
Hey,
much.
Andres, thank you. I really appreciate your time and coming on as a conversation partner with this, and it was a dialogue. It was good. To the YouTube audience, those of you who are still here, I usually keep about 10%, 7 to 10%. So if you get a few hundred views, there's still 30 or 50 of you out there. Thank you guys. Much love to you guys for sticking it out. And Andres, ideas are worth sticking it out for. So absolutely. And again, all relevant links will be down in the description field for you guys to check out. Andres, I'm going to say goodbye to you after I stop the record, and to the YouTube audience, thank you again, and thanks for joining us in the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.